The Republican Party's presidential frontrunner was convicted by a jury of his peers on 34 felony counts. That is the reality the Republican Party must now grapple with, if they were into reality. So that's an issue. But what makes this all even more difficult for the GOP is that Trump's conviction has precisely zero to do with President Biden. Trump was convicted in a case brought by a New York City prosecutor who does not report to President Biden. Trump is facing another 10 criminal charges from another local prosecutor in Georgia who does not report to President Biden. Even the two federal cases against Trump were brought by an independent special counsel who neither takes orders from nor coordinates with President Biden. And so Donald Trump has reacted the way he traditionally does when reality does not fit his preferred narrative. He lies about it. He claims without evidence that President Biden is the one who is really pulling the strings.
These are all Biden trials. They're all Biden cases. These aren't cases. These are Biden indictments. This is using the Justice Department to go after your political opponent.
Joe Biden is a threat to democracy. He's weaponizing law enforcement for a high-level election interference. Crooked Joe Biden ordered his top political opponent arrested. Oh, who is that opponent? Oh, it's me.
Trump has repeated some version of that lie over and over again for the past 2 years. But now he is his party's presumptive nominee. So every elected Republican in Congress must now attach himself or herself to that lie, no matter what reality dictates. And today we saw exactly what that looks like when Attorney General Merrick Garland testified before the Republican-led House Judiciary Committee at a hearing ostensibly about oversight of the Justice Department.
For the first time in American history, we do have a presidential administration that's working to put its opponent in jail. I mean, that's a fact.
You're intentionally allowing the department and the agents therein to engage in political prosecution of their opponents.
The lawfare we've seen against President Trump will do great damage well beyond our time in public service.
At one point in history, Republicans used to just excuse Trump's lies or pretend they didn't hear them. No longer. They have taken a knife to any tether that still binds them to reality and are now just floating away into the fact-free universe of Donald Trump like balloons or seagulls in a stiff wind. And it's not just the hardline MAGA wing of the party anymore. This was Congressman Jeff Van Drew, a so-called moderate from the state of New Jersey, trying to take a shot at state prosecutors Fani Willis and Alvin Bragg.
He ran for office saying he was going to put Donald Trump in jail. Alvin Bragg and also, again, the prosecutor in Fulton County, Georgia, they ran on that. And that's wrong.
Now, Congressman Van Drew directed those comments to Attorney General Merrick Garland. But again, Merrick Garland has no connections to the prosecutors in Georgia and Manhattan, Fani Willis and Alvin Bragg. And whatever your reservations about elected prosecutors threatening to criminally investigate members of the opposing party, Congressman Van Drew was making that argument while defending this guy.
She should be locked up, tell you right now.
She should be locked up. She should.
Lock them up. You should lock them up. Lock up the Bidens. Lock up Hillary.
Donald Trump, more than any other politician, is literally famous for wanting to jail his political opponents. But over the weekend, Trump tried to write that moment out of history.
Hillary Clinton, I didn't say lock her up, but the people would all say lock her up, lock her up. Okay. Then we won. And I said pretty openly, I say, all right, come on, just relax.
I didn't say lock her up. I know it was a long 27 seconds ago, but here it is again.
She should be locked up, tell you right now.
She should be locked up. She should.
I should also note here that Donald Trump's claim that he gave up trying to prosecute Hillary Clinton after he won the election is also very much a lie. We know from special counsel Robert Mueller's report that Trump was fixated on the idea of prosecuting Clinton and actually pressured his first Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, to do just that, to prosecute Hillary Clinton. Oh, but that whole thing, that's been wiped from Republican memory. Here's what Congressman Jason Smith told conservative media today while Merrick Garland was still testifying.
Attorney General Garland is not acting like the Attorney General of the United States. He's acting like Joe Biden's personal attorney. Well, that's not how it is.
Okay, so as Congressman Smith was accusing Merrick Garland of acting like President Biden's personal attorney, Merrick Garland's Justice Department was delivering opening arguments in the criminal trial of Joe Biden's adult son, Hunter Biden. If that is the kind of service you get from your personal attorney, maybe you should get a new personal attorney. For the record, in case your memory has become, untethered to reality, Donald Trump spent 2 years complaining that his first attorney general, Jeff Sessions, wasn't acting enough like his personal attorney. Then Trump fired Sessions and hired Bill Barr, who spent the rest of the Trump administration acting a lot like President Trump's personal attorney. But according to Republicans, Merrick Garland is the one doing the president's bidding. The thing is, Republicans are now realizing it is hard to claim you're the victim of a rigged justice system when their presidential candidate has spent his whole political career trying to rig the justice system. Merrick Garland, for his part, was not taking any of the bait.
I will not be intimidated, and the Justice Department will not be intimidated. We will continue to do our jobs free from political influence, and we will not back down from defending democracy.
Last night, at a private fundraiser in Connecticut, and for the first time since Donald Trump was found guilty of 34 felonies, President Biden confronted Trump's legal status head on. Here's the quote. "For the first time in American history, a former president is a convicted felon." Now he's running again. He's not only obsessed with losing in 2020, he's clearly been, and I mean this sincerely, a little unhinged. Now, so far, President Biden has only said the F word, felon, in private. But early post-conviction polls may change that strategy. The majority of Americans believe that the jury in Trump's case made the right call. According to a new Reuters Ipsos poll, 54% of independent voters say Trump's prosecution upheld the rule of law. And 10% of Republican registered voters say they are less likely to vote for Donald Trump following his conviction. I'm back with former U.S. Senator Claire McCaskill, and also joined by Jonathan Martin, senior political columnist at Politico. Thank you for being here. J. Martin, let me just first ask you what you see or what you understand to be the sort of trepidation inside the Biden campaign around having the president more aggressively call out Trump's convicted felon status and just go after him on his legal travails.
I think it's two things, Alex. I think it's number one, not wanting to play into the Republican hands of the idea that this was a political hit job that was planned in the West Wing and DOJ. And obviously, if Biden was to go at this head on, you'd certainly hear more of that kind of language from the Republicans. I think the other issue is Joe Biden himself. Look, as Senator McCaskill knows, Biden's a thoroughgoing institutionalist. He doesn't like the idea of sort of using that sort of an attack against his opponent, of, weaponizing his opponent's, legal exposure. That's not a natural thing for Joe Biden. And I think at every step of this campaign, Biden has had to be pushed a little bit to go harder and harder at Trump. For a while, he wouldn't even say Trump's name. I'm really curious if Biden makes that same attack he did last night that you showed there from the fundraiser on camera at a rally, because obviously it's a very different thing when you're saying that, at a donor event, Alex, than on camera.
Yeah, Claire, what is your expectation on that front? I mean, there's a debate in a couple weeks, and are we going to hear any of this?
Yeah, everybody knows he was convicted of felon. I mean, they know. Yeah. I mean, it's not like anybody in America doesn't know that Donald Trump was convicted. And I don't think Biden needs to be the one to emphasize it over and over again. What he does need to do is stand up for those jurors. He needs to stand up for the institution. He needs to stand up for the institutions of America that have made our country so wonderful. And that's what Trump is campaigning against. Mm-hmm. He's actually campaigning against the essence of our system. And that's what he needs to do at the debate. He needs to go after Trump in a way that is really strong, just like he did in the State of the Union. I mean, this guy, it's about strength and about the strength of America and about Donald Trump thinking that we suck. And that's what he needs to be doing.
Do you think that that sort of ideological or at least theoretical argument about the sanctity of democracy and democratic institutions resonates more with the 10 people who are going to decide the election as opposed to, do you really want a convicted felon running the country?
I do think it does, because I think that people are tired of the chaos. I think they're tired of the drama. I think Joe Biden got to be president in the first place because people wanted a nice guy who believed in America and who wanted to lift us up, not grind us down. I mean, Donald Trump wants everybody to be grievance and mad and everything's rigged and Joe Biden wants people to believe in the promise of this country. It's a pretty stark contrast, and if he does it with strength, I think he will have more effect on those independent voters than just harping on the convicted felon thing, because everybody knows it.
You know, J. Mart, your colleague Reed Epstein from your alma mater at the New York Times was saying on the Daily podcast that the more Trump is talking about the conviction and railing his supporters against Joe Biden and the DOJ, the less he's talking about inflation and immigration, the better it is for Joe Biden. I mean, Biden announced a very, very big executive order on immigration today. I wonder, you know, sort of what you make of the headline, to restrict migrants, Biden leans on Trump's favorite immigration law. What do you make of the political calculation there?
That Biden needs to address the border because it seems chaotic and it's done real damage to his political standing for the last 2.5 years. It's pretty straightforward. He would have loved to have signed any bill that had come out of the Congress earlier this year. Obviously, Trump stymied that effort. So he had no choice, I think, politically, but to turn to do this kind of an order. And it's something that I think, Alex, that he could hold up at the debate, hold up on the campaign trail when he's, you know, attacked on this. Says, I have taken a hard line on the issue. The question is, you know, was it too late doing this? Look, I think the shorthand on this election is pretty straightforward. If in October this is about Donald Trump, Joe Biden's got a good shot to win. If in October this is about Joe Biden, I think that Donald Trump is probably going to win. It's hard to recall a modern campaign where the two major party nominees really, really wanted the conversation to be about the other guy instead of them.
President Biden is on his way to France this evening, where he will mark the 80th anniversary of D-Day with a speech praising the strength of America's alliances. But a new piece in The Atlantic by McKay Coppins describes pervasive anxiety in Europe over whether the Western world order can actually survive a second Trump term. Fear of losing Europe's most powerful ally has translated into a pathologically intense fixation on the U.S. presidential race. European officials can explain the Electoral College in granular detail and cite polling data from battleground states. Thomas Bagger, the state secretary in the German Foreign Ministry, told me that in a year when billions of people in dozens of countries around the world will get the chance to vote, the only election all Europeans are interested in is the American election. Almost every official I spoke with believed that Donald Trump is going to win. Joining me now is McKay Coppins, staff writer for The Atlantic. McKay, thank you for being here. We're going to just set aside the European assessment of who is going to be the winner for a moment and just talk to me about I think it's almost hard to overstate the hyper-fixation of Europeans on this presidential race. You note you were talking to George Kent, the U.S. ambassador to Estonia, and you have this anecdote where he tried to make small talk about horticulture, but his gardener had other things on his mind. Can we talk about the vote in Congress? The gardener wanted the latest news on the Ukraine aid package. You traveled all over Europe for this piece. Can you talk a little bit about the level of interest and sort of what the catalytic event for that interest was?
Yeah, I was honestly taken aback by the fact that everywhere I went, with almost everyone I talked to at every level, whether it was, you know, a foreign minister or, you know, a 23-year-old grad student and low-level government worker, all of them were paying incredibly close attention to American politics, especially the U.S. presidential race. And I mean, the catalytic event is that they're terrified that Donald Trump is going to get elected again. You know, time and time again, the word that kept coming up in these interviews was existential, as in the stakes for this race are existential for Europe. And It's no secret why, right? Donald Trump has been very clear that he is not a fan of NATO. He has said both privately and publicly that countries that aren't paying what he considers their fair share deserve to be attacked by Russia. And for especially Eastern European countries, I spent time in Poland and Estonia, that is a really frightening thing to hear from the former and potentially future leader of the most powerful ally to Europe. And that fear of Trump's return is causing all kinds of reconsiderations of the relationship with the United States in ways that I found, frankly, pretty jarring.
Well, I mean, I would also assume Russia invading Ukraine, which is definitely in Europe's backyard, Western Europe's backyard, would strike fear in the hearts of many people in Western Europe. And the prospect of having someone in the Oval Office who is sympathetic to Vladimir Putin's ends or goals is probably terrifying. You know, you mentioned that Germany is planning for the possibility of a Trump second term. Can you talk a little bit more about their sort of thinking and why they seem so positive that this is Trump's race to lose?
Yeah, so the German Foreign Ministry, after Trump won the first election and sometime in the middle of that first term, they kind of realized that they needed to rethink their approach to America. You know, like a lot of Western governments, they have plans for dealing with developments in places like China or Russia. But because the alliance with the U.S. has always been so close, they never felt like they would have to do that for America. But now they do. And so they're developing contingency plans for the outcome of the 2024 election. They have a plan for if Biden wins, though most of the officials I spoke to in Germany and really across Europe do not think Biden is going to win. They have a plan for Trump winning, and in that plan, it really calls for figuring out which major issue sets are going to be destabilized by Trump's return to power, whether that's tariffs or Ukraine or NATO or climate change, and how they can try to get close to Trump's confidants. They're already kind of mapping out his inner circle and figuring out their way in there. But I have to tell you, the thing that actually most struck me was that they're also planning for a third scenario, which is a sustained period of uncertainty about the outcome of the election, paired with widespread political violence in the United States, something like January 6th, but on a much larger scale. And, you know, it's not that German officials necessarily think that's a very likely outcome, but given the instability in American politics over the past 8 years, their feeling is that it's not so outrageous a scenario that they shouldn't plan for it. And so that they are currently making plans for how to respond to that.
Well, yes, I think those of us who we're old enough to remember 2020, and so planning for something like that doesn't seem out of the ordinary if it is still, you know, a distressing landscape to look out upon. Foreign counterparts, you write. You're speaking about Victoria Nuland, the former Undersecretary of Political Affairs for the State Department. She says, foreign counterparts would say to me straight up, the first Trump election, maybe people didn't understand who he was or it was an accident. A second election of Trump, we'll never trust you again. I understand the sense of betrayal that Europeans are girding themselves for. But in terms of autocrats rising to power and sweeping through Western democracies, I mean, Europe has plenty of its own examples, right? They have Viktor Orban in Hungary. They have Marine Le Pen in France. They have Meloni in Italy. They have Duda in Poland. I mean, do they see Trumpism as an extension of that or as a singularly American phenomenon?
No, I think they see Trump as an extension of the same kind of right-wing nationalism and populism that is giving a lot of Western democracies in Europe problems. But it is different when it happens in America. I mean, there's just no other way to say it, right? The Western European countries, really European democracies in general, have looked to America for decades as a aspirational democracy, right? The city on the hill. I mean, it sounds cheesy in some ways, and it's easy to be cynical about it. But I have to tell you, I was really surprised by how often I encountered this kind of really idealistic sentiment about what role America is supposed to play in the free world, and the sense of kind of heartbroken betrayal at this idea that Trump could come back to power and that Americans would put somebody like Trump in power. It's not that they think that America is uniquely bad. It's just that they actually have been predisposed to think that America is uniquely averse to this kind of authoritarian politics. And seeing it now kind of tear through American politics is frightening and disorienting for a lot of Europeans.
Well, McKay, it's so deeply researched and so deeply reported. Everyone should check it out. McKay Coppins with The Atlantic. Thank you so much for your time and essential reporting, McKay.
Thanks, Alex.